and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. This week, our subject is Jane Seymour. Jane was highly praised for her gentle, peaceful nature, being called as gentle a lady as I ever knew by John Russell, and the Pacific by Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis for peacemaking efforts at court. Polydore Virgil commented that she was a woman of the utmost charm in both character and appearance. She was regarded as meek, gentle, simple, and chaste, with her large family with a lot of boys, making her thought to be suitable to have many children, male children, because her mother had had a lot of boys. But all of this flowery language was probably just because, unlike Henry VIII's first two wives, Jane's reputation stayed intact after her death. It was around this time that word reached court that Henry's first wife, the banished Queen Catherine of Aragon, had died at the age of 50. Anne and Henry were thrilled, and both dressed in yellow, an odd choice for January. They happily pranced around court, showing off Anne's pregnant belly and their 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. This was the new start they had been waiting for. Catherine was finally gone. Maybe this is what God was waiting for in order to grant the royal couple a son. This would be the start of a new chapter. It was reported that later in the day, both the king and queen wept for her death separately and alone. But that sounds like damage control to me. Henry had known Catherine had been sick and refused to allow their daughter to visit her mother, and refused to let her attend her funeral 3 weeks later. So I don't believe they were really that broken up about the death of his ex-wife. Any tears were performative at most, in my opinion. The day of the former Queen Catherine's funeral, the current Queen Anne miscarried the son she had been pregnant with. This would have been a horrifying experience, not just for Anne, but also her ladies, including Jane Seymour. Everyone was aware that this was Anne's last chance to produce a son and prove that God was on her side. This obviously was incredibly unfair, but Anne was out of chances with her husband, and she was likely to be banished like her predecessor. Henry could now move on to his third wife if he could get rid of Anne. His first wife, Catherine, was no longer in his way. Henry still desperately wanted a son, and Anne's miscarriage of his son had made him angry. On the day of Catherine's funeral, it was seen as a bad omen. Their marriage was all but over. Over the next few months, an investigation ensued. Thomas Cromwell presided over it, just as he had the end of the king's last proceedings. They pulled in every man who had ever flirted or been flirted with by the queen. And there were a lot of them. Queen Anne enjoyed flirting, a hobby her husband had appreciated in her youth, but now it was a liability. Most of the men said they had not slept with the queen. One, under torture, admitted guilt. It was probably all untrue, but they started to be executed for treason, and Queen Anne was arrested. This would have been shocking to everyone. When Catherine had fallen out of favor, she had been given a lot of chances to retire to a nunnery or agree to a divorce, and then was finally banished and separated from her teenage daughter. This is what everyone assumed would happen to Anne. But it wasn't what happened to Anne. She was arrested and then beheaded. This was a very different king than the king who had banished Catherine. I can only assume that Jane would have been alarmed. Before, he was kind of a slutty guy who moved on from his wives when they didn't have sons. But now you were risking losing your head as his out-of-favor wife. But it was too late to change her mind. Jane was in it too deep. King Henry had already decided Jane would be his next wife. King Henry and Jane Seymour were betrothed on the 29th of May, 1536, one day after Anne had been beheaded. So romantic. Ooh. The day after. So back to our modern day story that doesn't exist. So you're having this affair with your boss's husband, right? and your boss's husband has her killed and proposes to you the next day. This took a sudden dark turn. If I'm Jane, I'm freaking out right now. Now it's a survival game. And Jane had been in Anne's court, so if Anne was innocent, like I suspect she was, Jane would have known that it had all been set up, because they were together most of the time. They were then married 10 days later. If this seems fast to you, it did to everyone else too. Everything was moving very fast, and Jane was probably mentally still trying to catch up and hope for the best. King Henry was enjoying his new start and elated with his new wife. As a wedding gift, he granted her 104 manors in 4 countries, as well as a number of forests and hunting chases for her jointure, the income to support her during her marriage. She was being love-bombed, as Henry did, and she was probably hoping that this time would be different. He had, after all, been married to his first wife for 20 years. Anne had been a short-lived middle crisis. Maybe this would be okay. She was publicly proclaimed queen on the 4th of June, 1536. Her well-publicized sympathy for the late Queen Catherine and her daughter Mary showed her to be compassionate and made her a popular figure with the common people and most of the courtiers. She was never crowned because of plague in London, where the coronation was to take place. It was too dangerous. Henry may have also been reluctant to have her crowned before she had fulfilled her duty as a queen consort by bearing him a male heir. No boy, no coronation. The next month, Henry lost his only son, Henry Fitzroy, his illegitimate child with his former mistress, Elizabeth Blount. He was only 17, married but with no children. Henry was down to only 2 daughters that he had demoted from princesses to ladies. As queen, Jane was said to be strict and formal, just like Queen Catherine had been. The lavish entertainments, gaiety, and extravagance of the Queen's household, which had reached its peak during Anne Boleyn's time, was replaced by strict decorum. She banned the French fashions that Anne had introduced. She was trying to be the anti-Anne, because Anne had been beheaded. No one wanted to be Anne. Catherine of Aragon had lasted 20 years for a reason, so that was the look she was going for. She was also, though publicly Protestant, probably still a Catholic. Henry had accused the Catholic Church of monetary abuses. He was dismantling all of the Catholic institutions and selling off the property to raise money for the crown. One of these was Catesby Priory. This priory had been established in 1175 and was nearly 400 years old. Though Henry had found abuses within the Catholic Church in England, some of these priories were small and just trying to support their local communities. There was nowhere for the poor and destitute to go for help except, sometimes, their local priory. They fed the poor, they took care of them. This was likely the case with the Cistercian nuns at Catesby Priory. Queen Jane asked the king if she could buy the priory land from the crown and just allow the nuns to live out their lives on it. The king refused. With Catherine and Anne both dead, the Northerners saw their chance. They wanted to be Catholic. King Henry had split from the Catholic Church to divorce Catherine and marry Anne. Henry had forcibly been dismantling the Catholic Church in the north. The Northerners thought that without those 2 women, maybe the king would have a change of heart and reunite England and the papacy. They were wrong. Henry enjoyed his new role as supreme head of the Church of England. The organized protest, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, ended with many executions. Politically, Jane appears to have been conservative. Her only reported involvement in national affairs in 1536 was when she asked for pardons for the participants in the Pilgrimage of Grace. This didn't go well. She didn't ask in private, like, hey, baby, I know you're mad at these Catholics, but maybe you could punish them without killing them. She, in public, dropped to his feet and begged him for mercy for the Catholics. If you've listened to other episodes, you may remember that this was a common job of the queen, to intercede so the king can be less harsh but still seem like the big tough guy that just loves his wife. The problem here was that it was usually set up beforehand. It was an agreement between the king and the queen. Like, look, I need you to make me look good. Just beg me and I'll be like, sure, because I love you. This was just Jane trying to act like a queen. I don't know if she didn't know it was supposed to be set up, or if she really thought, yeah, this is what the king wants me to do. But Henry was not happy. He rejected this, reminding her of the fate of her predecessor when she had meddled in his affairs, which, if you listen to the last episode, she wasn't accused of meddling in his affairs. She was accused of sleeping with all of England. But now it's because she meddled in his affairs. Pretty much meaning, what the actual F are you doing? You need to remember that I killed my first wife. He was just straight up abusive at this point, and Jane had no out. Jane went back to being sweet and quiet. Her motto as queen was bound to obey and serve. And that kind of says it all. It does seem like Jane, like the Northerners, wanted her Catholic faith back. But now her husband was a guy that could, would, and had beheaded a wife. So this was a complicated relationship. Jane is often seen as kind of a doormat. She was so passive and submissive. In my opinion, this was a survival tactic. Catherine had been submissive, and although she had been banished to die alone, she hadn't been killed. Anne had not been at all submissive, and she had been beheaded, so choices were made. Jane also seemed very supportive of King Henry's oldest daughter, Mary. She didn't push to have her fully restored to a legitimate princess, but she did suggest that Mary be added back into the line of succession after any children that Jane and Henry were to have. Henry was still angry with his daughter. She had sided strongly with her mother in the divorce, refusing to follow his orders. Henry didn't like that. He was God's chosen king of England and supreme head of the Church of England. If you didn't listen to him, you were wrong. I think he thought his grandmother would have been proud of him. She had hoped that he would eventually be pope. To Henry, that's essentially what he was in England. But I suspect that his grandmother would have boxed his ears. She had been an extremely devout Catholic, and for the Renaissance, kind of an early feminist. She had liked Catherine of Aragon. She had supported their marriage. She helped them plan their marriage at the last minute after Henry's father had died. She would have loved her granddaughter Mary a great deal if they had the opportunity to meet. To me, Mary became the queen that Henry's grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, would have wanted to be. Check out Margaret Beaufort's episode if you need a refresher, but she definitely gives off Princess Mary vibes. But like King Henry had a similar personality to his grandfather, King Edward, Lady Mary Tudor's personality seems to have been a lot like her great-grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. Lady Mary had some damage control to do. Her father was angry, but her stepmother was supporting her. Jane brought up the issue of Mary's restoration both before and after she became queen. While she was unable to restore Mary to the line of succession, she was able to reconcile her with her father, Henry. Chapuis wrote to Emperor Charles V of her compassion and efforts on behalf of Mary's return to favor. A letter from Mary shows her gratitude to her stepmother. While it was she who first pushed for the restoration, Mary and Elizabeth were not fully reinstated to the succession until much, much later. Mary had enjoyed the father-daughter relationship that she had until she was 17. They were close. She could remember when her father loved her, and she wanted that back, even if, unlike her, he was anti-Catholic. Mary had recently lost her mother and the stepmother that hated her. She was isolated. Mary, at this point, was also nearly 21 and still unmarried. Without her father, the king's support, she had no dowry and no chance of finding a husband. She had been betrothed to princes and kings in her childhood, but then she had fallen out of favor with her father, so none of them materialized into marriage. Henry had been more preoccupied with his marriages and his children than his daughters' marriages and their children. If he had been a little less self-centered, he would have realized that with his support, his daughters probably could have ruled. Because they did. Especially the daughter of the great Queen Catherine. And if she had been married and possibly had a son, that would only bolster her claim. But Henry was all about Henry. And he thought it was really kind of him to include his eldest daughter in Christmas. Inviting your own child to Christmas seems like the bare minimum to do as a father. But during the Anne Boleyn days, Mary was not welcome at all. She had been seen as too big of a threat to Princess Elizabeth. So Mary was invited to Christmas in 1536 for the first time in quite a few years. She wrote a letter to his stepmother, Queen Jane, thanking her for all her efforts to repair her relationship with her father. Jane was pregnant by January, 7 months into the marriage to the king. This was seen as a good omen. Finally, God was on board with one of Henry's wives. Jane developed cravings during her pregnancy for quail, and Henry had it shipped from Calais for her. During the summer, she took no public engagements and led a relatively quiet life attended by the royal physicians. Henry decided to cancel his summer progress, not wanting to be too far from his pregnant wife. He claimed he didn't want her to worry. Jane was worried about the plague outbreak in London because, of course she was. It was the plague. But people saw her level of worry as overreacting. They were taking no chances with this pregnancy. She went into confinement in September 1537 and gave birth to the coveted male heir, the future King Edward VI, at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of October 1537 at Hampton Palace. This was a birth we have many details about. This was the first prince to be born and survive infancy in England since King Henry's own birth in 1491, 46 years earlier. Jane's labor had been difficult, lasting 2 days and 3 nights, probably because the baby was not well positioned. For me, this is #relatable. My first labor was also 2 days and 3 nights, and that is exhausting. You don't get much sleep, and then you have to have a baby. My labor was likely a much more sanitary environment, and even then the doctors were concerned for me for possible infection. Prince Edward was named Edward because he was born on the feast of St. Edward. Henry's Catholic was showing. Edward was christened at 3 days old on the 15th of October, 1537. Without his mother in attendance, as was the custom, she would have still been in confinement recovering from her 3-day birth. Prince Edward was the only legitimate son of Henry VIII to survive infancy. Both of his daughters, Mary, 21, and Elizabeth, 4, were present. Elizabeth carried Edward's train during the ceremony. After the christening, it became clear that Queen Jane was seriously ill. Thankfully, for me, cleanliness was a priority during my 3-day birth, but that wasn't the case with Queen Jane. Jane had started to recover from childbirth, but then took a turn for the worse when her baby was 1 week old. On October 19th, there was a procession to St. Paul's to pray for the Queen's recovery. Just 4 days later, the Queen suffered from severe bleeding. The following day, Thomas Cromwell was called for to comfort the King, because the Queen was dying quickly now. She died when her baby was only 12 days old, the 24th of October, 1537, at Hampton Court Palace, the same palace she had given birth to her son in. King Henry went from a high, getting the son he so desperately wanted, to a low, realizing that his wife, who had given that son, was desperately ill after childbirth, just as his mother had been before she had died. There is a rumor, believed by quite a few, that because of the long labor, Queen Jane had a C-section to save the baby, that King Henry had been told that he had to choose his wife or his baby, and he chose his baby because he could more easily replace a wife than a son. It is likely widespread because it sounds exactly like Henry VIII. That sounds like something he would say, but it cannot be true. A C-section in the 16th century was death, immediate bleeding to death. It would be used if the mother was dead or dying, but she wouldn't have survived for 12 days longer. So that's out, but it does say a lot about how people felt about King Henry. It could have been a pulmonary embolism or an infection or part of her placenta being left behind. The most unfortunate part of this theory is that an experienced midwife, even one in 1537, knew how to make sure they had the whole placenta. But the queen was attended to by royal physicians. They had a lot of knowledge, but childbirth wasn't their specialty. Had she been a peasant with the village midwife, she likely would have survived. Being queen may have been her downfall. In any case, childbirth is what killed her. Complications from a royal birth. Jane was buried on the 12th of November, 1537, after the funeral in which her stepdaughter Mary acted as chief mourner. A procession of 29 mourners followed Mary, one for every year of Jane's life. She was the only one of Henry's wives to receive a queen's funeral. She was really the only wife he mourned. She had given him a son, and she would forever be the saint who fulfilled his deepest wish and gave her life for it. She is said to be the only wife he truly loved. She is also the only wife of his to die a queen. Henry would be interred next to her a decade later. Choosing which of your 6 wives to lay next to for eternity seems like a big decision. But if you understand Henry, this was a no-brainer. Jane was his favorite wife, his most obedient wife, and the only wife he probably ever loved. And Jane's son was the next king of England. He was always going to pick Jane. After her death, Henry wore black for the next 3 months, and for the first time in his life, he stayed single. He wouldn't marry again for another few years. The last time he had been single was 30 years ago, when he was a teenager. Henry's advisors were negotiating other marriages because he still only had one legitimate son. But Henry wasn't here for it. He sunk into a pretty severe depression. Why had God taken his favorite and most honored wife from him so soon? 46-year-old King Henry put on weight for the first time in his life. He became obese and developed diabetes. If he had been a different man between his marriage to Catherine and his marriage to Anne, it was nothing compared to the completely different man he was after Jane died at the young age of 29. And that is where we will leave it for this week. What did you think of Jane Seymour? To me, she was almost an innocent bystander in the craziness of the English court. She hadn't survived the birth, but if she had, I think she would have likely stayed in the king's favor, even if she had just had girls after that. She had at least had one boy. They probably would have had more children. We don't know because her marriage to Henry only lasted just over a year. She was survived by her husband, King Henry, who would still have 3 more wives, but none of them would surpass Jane in his favor. When King Henry died, he would be married next to Jane, his very favorite wife. She was also survived by her only son, Prince Edward. He would indeed follow his father and be the next King of England, King Edward VI, the first Edward since the House of York was in power, and likely a tribute to Henry's own grandfather, King Edward IV. The relationship she developed with her stepdaughters, Mary and Elizabeth, would carry on. They adored their little brother. Edward also paved the way for Mary and Elizabeth to be reinstated in the line of succession because as a boy, he would come first. They could be his spares. And indeed, they were. All 3 of them would take their turn ruling England. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at longlivethequeenpodcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can support me at buymeacoffee.com/longlivethequeen. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.